On today's episode, we're speaking with Judy Seif, a Copt who grew up in Melbourne but has since moved to Perth. Judy, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
So what was that opportunity like, going to meet His Holiness, spending all that time in the motherland?
I think I didn't realise how wonderful that opportunity was until I saw His Holiness Pope Shenouda III in Australia. So when I saw him in Australia in Melbourne, or going to consecrate and bless the monastery in Heathcote, or at any of the churches, the crowds were so massive that you couldn't even get within half a kilometre of him. It was just, he's inaccessible unless you're a VIP guest. But that wasn't the case in Egypt. He really truly supported Abuna Daniel with this youth trip, and the access to His Holiness was unbelievable. So as an example, some of the early recollections of that trip was His Holiness Pope Shenouda personally lectured us in Coptic lessons for 3 classes. I understand the first trip didn't have that, so we feel quite blessed. So he taught us three classes in Coptic. No one else taught them. He did personally in a proper classroom with lectures and a whiteboard and a blackboard. And would tell us the history about how the phrases and sentences and letters were formed. And he also organised for us to have a mass at the cathedral on Christmas night, but not just to have the mass. We sat in the VIP seats in the front, literally behind the bishops. We all sat. And then he arranged for us to have supper with him up in his offices in the cathedral after the Mass. So pretty amazing, a group from Melbourne and Sydney having supper, breaking the fast after Coptic Mass at Coptic Christmas. And the other thing that was a huge memory for me was we were going to his monastery to sleep over for, I think it was 3 days, 2 nights, 3 days, or 4 nights. And he was travelling in the Pope mobile, his own car, behind the coach. But he, at one point, pretty early, once we were outside the outskirts of Cairo, he made a decision to actually hop on our coach, the tourist bus, and travelled for the remainder of the journey in our coach. And I don't know how I ended up sitting in close proximity, but I had, I think, Abuna Daniel sitting next to me. I was opposite His Holiness Pope Shenouda, and then next to His Holiness Pope Shenouda was Ambashaya, who I knew as Abuna Hananya in Melbourne. And Abuna Hananya was replaced by Abuna Daniel in 1980. So it was pretty amazing. I was sitting amongst some pretty eminent Coptic clergy, very holy people.
That sounds amazing.
But the amazing thing about His Holiness Pope Shenouda was he was just amazingly humble and had an amazing sense of humour. He had amazing wit and a dry wit, and he would set us off laughing with his jokes. And I remember just being astounded because I was sitting in very close proximity to him. He started giving Bible lessons and sermons in the coach on the way to the monastery, because it was several hours, without notes. He would know every Bible, not just Bible stories, but he would know the chapter and the verses of the entire Bible. And I couldn't believe it. I think I cracked a joke and said to His Holiness Pope Shenouda, because that's how relaxed it was, I said to him, "What do you have in the morning? I want some." He just laughed and laughed and laughed and said, "Put it this way, it's not alcohol or drugs." But he was just really humorous. He had the whole coach just laughing. And I was just really shocked that he was delivering full-on sermons and Bible lessons in the coach without key points, without notes. And it wasn't sort of general statements. He was quoting scripture, Bible verses. Yeah, amazing.
For the youth that haven't been to Egypt or haven't been to Egypt on a youth trip yet, what do you say to them?
I encourage the Coptic Church of Australia I hope you're listening, if the Coptic Church of Australia can start up these Coptic youth trips to Egypt. I mean, the 2 trips that have happened already were Sydney and Melbourne combined. There's no reason why it couldn't be a youth trip with all states and territories combined. And if it could be set up with His Holiness Pope Shenouda, that would be just brilliant, because the good thing about this trip is it had the right balance of the Coptic heritage and history and visiting the very historic churches and monasteries, combined with the touristy sightseeing like the pyramids and the Sphinx and the temples.
Moving on to your time back in Melbourne after you arrived back on the trip, when did you decide that it was time to move on from Victoria onto greener pastures?
Yeah, well, I had always grown up in Melbourne, and as expected, I completed Year 12 and went to university in Melbourne, and I did a Bachelor of Arts with a double major in politics. And I couldn't decide between pursuing a career in journalism or a career in law, but the criminal law advocacy and courtroom drama really fascinated me. So after doing 1.5 years working in the Magistrates Court of Victoria, I decided I wanted to pursue a career in law. So after doing several law subjects as part of my Monash degree, an opening came up to do a fast-track graduate degree in law in Darwin, and collapsing a 3-year law degree into 2 years. So I chose that option to go to Darwin. I was still fellowshipping at the Oakley Church with Abuna Danielle as my church minister, or Abuna at the time. And I was pretty apprehensive about leaving my family and friends to go to Perth. I knew nobody there. And I went to see Abuna Danielle to say my goodbyes. And I have a very strong memory of him giving me a King James Bible, Holy Bible, and writing a really lovely note in it, encouraging me with my studies and saying that may I know the love, joy and peace that surpasses all understanding of our Lord God, Jesus Christ. And I still have that Bible 30 years later, after leaving to go to Darwin at the age of 20. And yeah, I really, really treasured that Bible, and it brought me great comfort. I still read that Bible. It's a bit old now, but I still love that Bible. And it was really encouraging to have my youth minister and local Abuna, my local priest, not saying, no, stay back, you can't go, you can't be away from family, but instead really encouraging me to pursue my studies.
What was it like for you when you returned to Melbourne after that time away from the family and the community?
Well, when I returned, I really appreciated family, and there was an opportunity to, when Abuna Victor decided that it was enough to renting the Northcote Church for 15 years, I think it was, he decided, with the support of his congregation, to build a church in Preston. So Abuna Victor is not only responsible for being the first Coptic priest to Melbourne and Victoria, and the first Coptic priest to purchase the first church in Victoria in St Mary's, Kensington. He was also the first Coptic priest to build a Coptic church in Melbourne. So he established Preston, and a parcel of land was identified in Preston. I recall that there was a great deal of opposition from the local neighbourhood. They didn't want the Coptic church in Preston. So my father, Alphonse, and Abuna Victor actually had to go to court to fight against lawyers to challenge the opposition. And I'm told by my dad that they actually didn't hire lawyers. They went and there was a mass that morning at church, and I think it was the St Luke's feast, and they just felt that the Lord was on their side. They went to the court case, the tribunal, and they won. And then after that, the church was built. But as the Melbourne congregation of St Mark's was running out of funds, I was asked by my father's congregation to travel to Sydney to collect donations from the Sydney churches. So I recollect travelling with my father, Alphonse, and my uncle Steve and Seif. We travelled to Sydney by train, not by plane, by train, to save funds. And I was given St George's Church, and I had a letter from Abuna Victor. It was handed to the priest, and I was set up at a table, And I was quite proud because out of the three of us, actually the church where I collected the donations raised the most money. When I was in Sydney that weekend, Abuna Danielle received a message that I was in town for the weekend. So he graciously organised very quickly for all the Sydney youth to meet up in a park so that I could meet them all and be introduced and have a barbecue. So yeah, it was a really blessed time. And then I travelled back to Melbourne with my uncle and my dad, and the raised funds were handed over to St Mark's.
Do you recall meeting any of those youth that you had travelled with to the youth trip as well? Or?
Yeah, definitely, yeah. So even though it was natural for me to gravitate towards the Melbourne youth because I knew them, it was a great opportunity to meet the Sydney youth and to hang out with them at a barbecue and put names to faces. And I think from memory, because it was not that long after the Coptic trip to Egypt, the main subject of conversation was the Coptic youth trip. And a lot of the youth from Sydney who hadn't gone on the trip really felt like they were missing out and said, oh, wish we had gone, because our excuses for not going now seem quite insignificant.
You travelled to Perth further down the line. How did the Perth connection come about? Because you're still living in Perth at the moment. So.
Yeah. So I graduated in law as a lawyer. So my understanding is I'm the first Coptic Egyptian lawyer in Australia, and I've completed my law studies in 1992. And so initially I worked as a solicitor for a few years in Carlton, Melbourne, and right near the University of Melbourne, in fact, where my mother did her PhD when they first migrated. And then after that, an opportunity came up to manage a criminal law practice in Perth. The criminal law practice was Melbourne owned, but they needed a manager in Perth. So because relocation costs were all included with the job, I decided good time for an adventure. So in 2000, I travelled to Perth with my young family, my husband and young family, and I lived in Perth and tried to establish myself in a very, very busy career as not just as a manager of staff, but also going off to court every day. It was quite a challenging job, and the job was also challenging because of the type of clients. There was a lot of media, so I had to do a lot of television and radio interviews as well as the pressure and preparation of court work.
What was the Coptic community in Perth like at the time?
Quite small compared to Melbourne. There are only 2 churches in Perth. There's one in Wanneroo, but the older and first church in Perth is the church in East Victoria Park with Abuna Abram Abdul Malik. So that's the church I visited, and but how my Coptic connection happened in Perth, I knew no one. I had no family, no friends in Perth, just my work colleagues, is that I attended a legal aid seminar in the early years, and I was introduced to a young Coptic lawyer called Marianne Farag. And when I realised she was Coptic, I think I made a throwaway comment that I really miss Coptic Easter and Coptic Christmas. So without telling me, she went home to I think within a few weeks it was Coptic Easter, and her mum and her family invited my family and I over for Coptic Easter lunch, and the family was so welcoming. I met all her family, her mum, her 2 brothers, her 2 sisters, and it wasn't a case of stay for an hour and leave. I stayed there all day and felt like they were a second family. So through that family connection, I eventually had a second family in Perth and would regularly visit them. And then also through Abuna Abram, I sometimes went to the East Victoria Park Church, and an opportunity came up at my local church near to where I live. There was an international day, Pray for Egypt, and so that means all the Christians around the world were praying for Egypt that particular day of that particular year. When they were aware that I was Coptic Egyptian, they invited me to the church to lead speeches in Coptic and Arabic, English letters of course, And so I went to the Farag's house and spoke to the eldest son, Michael, and he helped me write the speeches in Arabic and Coptic using English letters as what was appropriate. And because it was also a fundraising event, when I discovered that this church was not having anything about the Coptic church or Christians in Egypt, I approached Abuna Abram of East Victoria Park Church and asked him if I could have some memorabilia to have on display to make the occasion more interesting. I was only expecting to leave with a small box, but I left with a car and boot full of items and memorabilia, and Abuna Abram was incredibly generous. He lent me some priest wear, a couple of tunias, deacon tunics, Coptic crosses, jewellery, holy books, agbiyas, artwork, paintings. It was incense holder. I had the whole lot from the Coptic church store.
You could have started up another church.
Yeah, it was amazing. And so I actually was able to set up 2 trestle tables at this International Prayer Day for Egypt. And I was told afterwards by the minister of that church they were very grateful because the event raised several $1,000s for Egypt's Copts. And he said that that was unusual for that type of event, and that because of all the Coptic memorabilia that was on display, and I had invited Marianne's mother, Nadia Farag, to come and help me host the tables, because there were lots and lots of questions from the Christians at that event wanting to know a bit more about the Coptic church, and if there was persecution in Egypt, and if we had a pope and that sort of thing. So it was lovely to be able to give back in my own capacity, not just relying on my father's history, but being able to give back myself at this event.
What was the particular occasion surrounding this International Day? Because I haven't heard of one since.
They have an International Day every year. The international organisation...
Perth specifically?
No. This international event is run all over the world, and they choose a particular country every year. So that particular year was Egypt. So they have this International Day Pray for Egypt in all Christian churches all around Australia, in America, England, and because the local church were aware that I was Coptic Egyptian, I was invited to lead it.
What was missing back in the early days of the Coptic Church in Australia that you see nowadays and that you wish you would have had growing up?
That's a hard question, because as one of the children of the original Copts of Melbourne, and obviously because my father was a leader in the community and the head deacon, there was a lot of respect for my father. So I imagine I was probably not that much different than being a daughter of an Abuna. So it was an okay time, because the community was so small in those early days. It was a very close community, very, very close. And even though I was born in Australia and I went to a private girls' school and I went to a major university, we were still different. The black curly hair, that we looked different. We went to a different church on weekends, ate different food. So even though we tried to assimilate, I knew I was different. I knew I was Coptic Egyptian. So there was a real blessing about the early years. And in fact, one hymn I absolutely loved hearing in church in my early years at St Mark's in the 70s was the hymn Kinisa Telepteia. I love that hymn. It's unfortunate it's not played much these days, but that pulls at the heartstrings when I hear that song.
What's the English translation of that? For our viewers watching.
The English translation is my church, my Coptic church, in terms of belonging to the Coptic church. Yeah, sorry about that.
That's
yeah,
all right.
And but these days, with all the churches and the monasteries and the community growing, there's a greater presence, and I think the being a minority and the prejudice and racism that was there when I was growing up isn't really there anymore. everyone knows who Coptic Egyptians are. Everyone's heard of Egyptians. Everyone pretty much these days knows that we have our own Pope. So in some ways, modern day Australia is a bit more accepting and tolerant of minority groups like the Coptic Egyptians. And I think now, because of satellite TV, news about the plight of Copts in Egypt that wouldn't have been heard 40, 50 years ago is now heard all around the world and seen. Everyone has an iPhone to capture what's happening on the streets. And so there's a greater understanding of the Copts in Egypt, and a greater understanding of why Copts like my parents migrated to Australia.
Judy, thank you so much for sharing all those lovely memories with us today.
Thank you, Bishoy, for having me.